All right, welcome, and thank you for joining us at the conversation today, presented by the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. My name is Ed Schwarzschild, and I'm a fellow of the Writers Institute and Director of Creative Writing here at UAlbany. Before I introduce today's guest, Lysley Tenorio, let me remind you that this and all our author interviews are posted on our YouTube channel you can always find that at nyswritersinstitute.org under the conversation. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And if you are enjoying programming like this, please feel free to support it by making a donation at nyswritersinstitute.org. We would, of course, be really grateful. Our guest today, as I mentioned, is the writer Lysley Tenorio. He is the author of the short story collection Monstress, fantastic collection. It was named a Book of the Year by the San Francisco Chronicle. He is the recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Whiting Award, a Stegner Fellowship, and the Rome Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He's had residencies at MacDowell, Yaddo, a great place in Italy that I won't try to pronounce. His stories have appeared all over the place in The Atlantic, Zoetrope, Ploughshares, and more. His work has been adapted for the stage in San Francisco and in New York City. He is a professor at St. Mary's College, and his newest book is the novel, The Son of Good Fortune, and that's what we'll be talking about today. And we'll be talking about writing and other things as well, but mainly about the incredible new novel, The Son of Good Fortune. Lysley, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to see you again.
Oh, it's great to see you. And you look the same as when I saw you more than 10 years ago, I think. It's kind of amazing how you've managed to do that.
It's the Zoom filter.
Powerful Zoom filter. Could we start with the story of how Lysley Tenorio became a writer? Where you got the idea, where you got the inspiration, who were your first guides or mentors or teachers, how the notion of becoming a writer even occurred to you?
Right. You know, compared to a lot of writers I know, I feel like I came to it relatively late. I remember going to grad school, I did an MFA, and hearing my classmates talk about the novels they tried writing when they were like 12. And you know, I was watching Dynasty at 12. I wasn't writing anything, and it didn't really. You know, I read as a kid, but it wasn't something I really considered. But then in college, I took a course with a writer named Bharati Mukherjee, Indian American writer. I didn't know she was a writer at the time. I was just taking her lecture course to fulfill a graduation requirement. And I found out she wrote books. So I figured, why not read one of her books? And I picked up her collection called The Middleman and Other Stories. It's a collection of stories about contemporary immigrant America. And I remember reading one story called Fighting for the Rebound. And there was a Filipino character in it. And I remember vividly realizing this is the first Filipino character I've ever encountered in American fiction. You know, after 20 plus years of being a reader, I finally see a character who even has a remote, resemblance to my experience. And it was so impactful, and it made me realize how absent Filipino Americans are from the popular culture as represented by movies, TV, radio, and of course books. And I thought I want to try this out. You know, it was the first piece of writing that not only impacted me, but made me realize there is a larger relevance to this. There's actually something meaningful here that could have an impact. And I thought I want to try to do that. And I started taking writing classes, and I wasn't very good. And I was totally motivated by my politics, this insistence that, I'm trying to claim my space in America. And, it's an important goal or objective, but that was definitely, at the forefront of the work. I remember someone called my stories Immigrant Tragedies of the Week, where a dark immigrant secret was, revealed on page 9 of a 12-page story. And I remember a teacher even underlined thesis statements in my stories because I was so concerned about, message. I wasn't very good, but it meant a lot to me. It was the only thing I really cared about. And when I realized that it was or could be a viable educational path, I decided to pursue it. And I've sort of, as best as I could, or as best as I can, I've arranged most of my major life choices around writing.
Mhm. When when did it start to move away from the stories with the thesis statements? Do you remember that, like the first story where you're like, hey, I've sort of, I'm doing something different, or I've jumped up to some other kind of level, or whatever might have transformed from those early stories to the kind of stories that would eventually turn into the stories in Monstress?
I think once because that happened to me in grad school where my teacher underlined the thesis statements. So I think after that, I was very conscious of articulating those kinds of statements. So as I would edit, I would look for anything that seemed as though I was trying to hold the reader's hand towards some kind of agenda, thematic, political, or otherwise. And I think when I finally realized that there's only so much that a writer can control, and for the most part, that's really what's happening on the surface. You just hope that what is happening on the surface resonates with other things, and maybe you can kind of position the reader, at least in a particular kind of, I don't know, interpretive realm, where hopefully you're not too off the mark. You hope for that, but really you can only control what's happening on the surface. And so once I understood that, it just sort of recommitted me to just the story itself, and in many ways plot and character. I'm a really plot driven writer. I like plot. I begin with plot. That's the kind of thing I can control. So I just cross my fingers and hope that if I can get it on the page, hopefully it resonates with other things that I'm concerned with.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. You mentioned Mukherjee and that story, fighting for the rebound, I think you said. After that, did you start seeking out other voices that you could find yourself in conversation with? Were there other authors that you gravitated towards after that?
Yeah, for sure. I remember, she'd already been established, but I didn't know much about contemporary literature. Jessica Hagedorn, a
Sure.
Filipino-American writer, I started seeking her work out. The anthology Charlie Chan is Dead, one of the first Asian American literary anthologies to come out of a major press. That was critical to me. And I also just started reading more short stories. Short stories is what I really fell in love with. And I remember buying my first copy of Zizova. That was the very first literary magazine I ever bought. And I just, I felt so, I don't know, literary, I guess. So I certainly started actively seeking out Asian American writers, but really just contemporary American short stories.
Yeah.
That's really what kind of got me energized.
Yeah, well, people watching this interview, if you're interested in contemporary American short stories, let me hold up the book Monstress again. It's just essential reading. But I do want to transition from. You in interviews I've seen with you previously too. You identify as a short story writer, and yet we're here to talk about your novel. So, what was that transition like for you? Did you feel an obligation to write a novel? Did you feel that you had found a story that just needed the space of a novel? How did the Son of Good Fortune come to be?
Right. Well, I guess maybe the most immediate and superficial answer is that I was contractually obligated to write a novel because it was a 2-book deal. And my original, I don't know, I'll just share it anyway. Maybe it'll inspire or reassure someone. The original deadline for the manuscript submission for the novel, I think, was 2011. And I think I finally got it in like 2018 or 19. At a certain point, the only kind of literary quality that I was going for was just to not be sued. So it's like avoid litigation. That's the artistic bar, and mission accomplished. But beyond that, it's a story that the short story was by no means was it or is it a training ground for me. Maybe it is for other writers, but it didn't prepare me for this longer work. With the story, you're thinking about economy, and with the novel, suddenly you have all the space in the world to write whatever you want. And I think once I allowed myself to loosen up that idea of perfection, with a short story, I think it does demand a kind of perfection. You can hold it in your head. Ideally, a reader is reading the entire story in one sitting, a novel you live with. So it's a more forgiving form. And once I gave myself a little bit of leeway and didn't question every scene or every motivation, it got a little easier. It was also a very, very different novel at the beginning. The original novel was about these sniffer dogs trained by the FBI to sniff out pirated DVDs, and these DVD pirates trying to assassinate these dogs in the Philippines, based on a true story. And when I saw this, I was like, I can do something with this. So I spent my first sabbatical trying to write this novel about this Filipino kid who kind of goes astray, and next thing you know, he's trying to assassinate these dogs. It was fun, on the surface, it was fun to write, but it just didn't have any substance, and I didn't really care about the story. All I really cared about was this relationship between this young Filipino man and his mother, who was kind of sort of larger than life, and they of course became Excel and Maxima. So with that, when I realized, oh, it's the relationship that I'm really compelled by, not the story, I then had to create a whole plot or story around a relationship, which is counterintuitive for me. I'd said earlier, for me, it's all about plot. Plot can get me started. Plot gets me excited. And I had to work the other way around. I mean, I'm a slow writer anyway, but I think that made it even slower.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating. I want to read the Sniffer Dogs.
I should go find it somewhere.
What was that? What was that book called?
It was called, because that's the preliminary pages that were sold with the collection. And at the time, I found this great quote by the Filipino national hero Jose Rizal. I think it was him. The quote was, well, the title I took from a longer quote was "Awaken your people and put them in movement," which I think is just so wonderfully clunky and awkward. That I was like, I love that. It sounds like such a horribly translated line, but it's kind of cool. Awaken your people and put them in movement. So I think if I wish, I don't know where it is, but my original contract has awaken your people and put them in movement.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about plot and character, and of course the mother-son relationship is at the heart of The Son of Good Fortune. And it's also interesting to hear you talk about the early, politics and thesis statements in your work. I mean, this novel, it sort of bangs up against so many huge political issues, right? I mean, the undocumented, immigration, attitudes towards Asian Americans, and yet it's a story. It's a character-driven story all the way through. Was that, how did you wrestle with that? I mean, you've talked about it a little bit already, but in the course of writing the novel, how did you modulate the way you treated immigration, undocumented people, and other issues?
Right. No, that's a really good question, and it's something I grappled with, and something that made me really nervous. We're at a point where the subject or topic you choose to write about, or the characters you choose to write about, you make the wrong move, you get in a lot of trouble. I'm not a fan of that kind of glomming onto that kind of thing that you see on social media. So I was very conscious of the fact that I am not an undocumented immigrant, and yet I'm writing about an undocumented experience. So I wanted to be as knowledgeable and as responsible as possible. I did a lot of research. I read a lot of interviews with undocumented individuals, especially Filipino individuals, young people. The whole, our immigration policies are just so screwed up. It's just a lot to keep track of. And I gathered as much information as I could. And as often happens, I think, with writers, when they accumulate all this information, you almost feel this obligation to make sure you incorporate it into the work, almost in a way to prove your street cred, right? Mm-hmm. But at a certain point, I was just getting overwhelmed with all this information. And I had to remember, this is not a social document that you're writing. Maybe someone might see it that way, and that's great. But what you're working on is a novel. It's a story. And And I think it was it John LaRue, rest in peace, who told us labor in the particular. I feel like he was the one who told us that. And I thought, that's your job. Write about this particular character. He is undocumented. Of course, it informs his experience and it informs his view of the world, but he's still an individual and he's not a representation or a representative. I understand he may be read that way, for better or for worse, but I can't control. What I can control is his story as an individual character. So once I had to recommit to that to get through the book.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, another way that the book operates so powerfully is that the characters, whether they're immigrants or not, are almost unified by this struggle around what you could almost call homelessness, right? There's this search for home, for a place that unites maybe not all, I can't do a whole catalog, but almost all the central characters of the book are in some way searching for a home. Mm-hmm. And the book has those H's that are strewn through it from the helicopter pads in Hello City. How were you thinking about homelessness as well as you wrote, or the drive for these characters to find something they could call home?
Right. And that was always in my mind as I was writing this. I think it's, every writer has an obsession or set of obsessions. And I think the idea of home and where one belongs and how you construct home, have multiple homes, I'm always thinking about that. And clearly that's, informed by my experience growing up, in an immigrant family. So I think that is something that unites these characters. Sab, Excel's girlfriend, she is, an American citizen, but she doesn't have a sense of belonging or of place. And even his one friend from, I think it was junior high school, he's trying to find a place where he fits in, his closeted friend. So it's definitely, it was definitely in my mind as I was writing. I think the challenge was to not make that search for a home too apparent, and to not make it the primary motivation, because I this is so much about a mother and a son, and I think when I really started understanding this book, it really became about recognizing who your family is, recognizing who your mother is. I think the challenge for Excel, in my mind, is whether or not he can finally realize that the strongest person in the world in his life, emotionally, psychologically, and even physically, because her physical strength is very important to me, is he going to realize that his great advantage in life is the fact that he actually is the son of Maxima. For all the mistakes she might have made, I think one could argue it's the one thing he's got going for him.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. She is just such an extraordinary character. I guess we probably have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. And I have a bunch. I'm going to try to sort through them. I mean, I guess this connects to home in a way, but the way the structure of the novel gives us these 2 moments. It sort of moves through 2 different time strands, or there's 2 different chronologies going on in the novel, and they intersect, of course. And there's 2 different locations. There's Hello City, which is a sort of a invented location, and then there's Colma, which is a real place that we could all go visit. Can you talk a bit about how you structured the novel using those 2 locations and the sort of time frames?
Right. That was something I really struggled with. In earlier drafts, I tried squeezing the entire Hello City storyline into 1 chapter, and it just became like this big, ugly tumor that was just attached to the body of this book. And it just read really badly. And I also think I was doing that because I thought the storyline in Hello City just wasn't very interesting. So I thought, just get it over with. But I realized that there really was a story there. And my job, of course, was to make it interesting. If it wasn't working, then make it work, right? Mm-hmm. But once I realized that it was expanding, I had to be okay with going back and forth between present and past. And my fear in doing that was that it seemed kind of clunky. Every time I would shift to the past tense, I kept thinking of remember when that skit Wayne's World, when they do the flashback, they would go, I felt like I was doing that every time I flashed back to Hello City. I was like, oh my God, this is so clunky. But going back to the idea of the novel, I was like, if I establish a pattern and I do it well, the reader will go along. Just trust that the reader will go along with it. So I just crossed my fingers and trusted that, okay, by page 40, let's say, I've established a pattern. The reader understands. We're going to go back and forth. And my editor seemed to think it worked, so I stuck with it. But that was something I was it just seems so basic, but for me, I was very apprehensive about that.
Yeah. No, I loved it. I thought it created real tension that you just controlled in a really effective way. Though now, if I ever listen to the audiobook, I hope they have the like in between the chapters. That would be great.
You should have had me do that. The audio.
This is a tough question to ask in terms of I'm not asking you to give away the novel because I know people are still finding their way to it. But when we talk about a novel as kind of a loose, baggy monster, that kind of Jamesian idea, another element of the novel I loved is that you didn't like tie everything up so tightly that it was like a neat little package. You let it be this loose, baggy monster in a way, and you didn't feel the need to resolve everything.
Right.
And it's just another question about how you balance that. Were you tempted to? How did you know what to leave, what to give us some resolution about, and what to leave unresolved? How did you do that calculus?
Right. I think our instinct for telling stories is to end them with a sense of closure. And I hate the word closure. I don't think closure exists in the real world. And so I resist anything that might feel like closure. Maybe that's that idea of wrapping things up tightly. What's important is whenever I end a story, or in this case, the novel, I always ask myself, now that these characters have been subjected to all these different events and they've reached the ending, what have they lost and what have they gained? And that's really all I'm concerned with. And I hope that I make clear to some extent, even if it's just on the surface, what it is both Excel and Maxima have lost over the course of the story and what they've gained. And if it means that only addressing those things still leaves, certain characters' fates unresolved or unanswered, I think that's okay, because their ultimate outcome in terms of event, what happens to them after the final page, that's something I can't control. I can only control what their concerns have been over the course of the story and what they've lost and gained along the way. I think the same is true for stories as well. But I think with the novel, I felt a lot more freedom to resist that sense of closure.
Yeah. Thank you. Listening to you talk, it's like a craft talk. It makes me want to get back to writing. Like, and just with your voice in my head, it's just such a, just such a powerful, the kind of voice you want from your teacher, the kind of inspiration you want to hear from the people you're writing with. What has it been like for you to be a teacher these last, 10, 15, 20 years? To go from being on one side of the workshop table to being on the other side of the workshop table, or if it's a circle, I don't know, you're at the head of the circle or whatever it is. But how has that affected your writing? How has it been for you to make that just another transition, I suppose, from the workshop student to the workshop leader these last 20 years?
Right. I think teaching keeps me open to the possibilities of writing. I teach craft seminars and I, have my reader of craft essays, but I'm always concerned with, my students not only understanding what some of these, critical ideas are, but understanding how and why we might challenge those ideas. So teaching kind of, in a way, keeps me on my toes. It really does. Just when I think I've figured out my own relationship to narrative and what my expectations are, I get a story or I read an essay or something, and it makes me rethink my approach. I mean, I've been teaching workshops since, I don't know, since like 2003, I think. And just this past year, I decided to redo the way I teach workshop. One, just to keep it interesting for myself, but two, because I'm realizing that there are different ways to understand narrative, and different writers learn better in different kinds of workshopping or class formats. So it just keeps me open. I mean, of course, it sometimes strains the same muscle. So by the by the end of the teaching week, it's not so easy for me to get back onto the computer and start writing. But it's still ultimately a symbiotic relationship, teaching and writing, and a beneficial one.
Have you seen, I mean, we started the interview with your story about coming across that Mukherjee story and having to kind of transform your sense of what was possible in your life. Have you seen that happen to some of your students? Have you seen them kind of come across something in an anthology or in a book, and just watch them kind of shift?
Yeah, I think I see that when we really, I mean, I definitely see that in workshop. Sometimes someone will, whether it's me or another student, will make a point, and you do see that light bulb going off in students' heads. But I think when we're reading, I mean, it sounds so cheesy, when we're reading some of these craft essays, it really kind of does open their eyes to the possibilities and the strategies that have often been used. But again, I think in realizing these things, it encourages them to question them as well. So yeah, I think I've seen a lot of those moments.
Great. And I mean, just for a last question, if you don't mind saying, but no worries if you don't want to talk about it. What are you working on now? New novel, stories? Where are you at?
Now, right now, I'm working on what I hope is a novel and stories. I always call it a cheater's novel. So I'm hoping that I can put together a collection of stories that I can pass off as a novel. And so I'm like, I'm trying to read novels that do that, like, Visit from the Goon Squad, They're There. And it's linked by the OFW phenomenon, and OFW stands for Overseas Filipino Workers. So, a large percentage of the Philippines per capita is generated by Filipinos who leave and go work in other countries. And they're usually domestic workers, caregivers, etc. And without fail, every time I go to another country, I encounter an OFW. And what always happens is they'll look at me and they'll be like, I think he's Filipino, but he doesn't look like a worker. He looks like he's here on vacation. And that's a rare thing. It also makes me realize how privileged I am. I remember when I was one year, we visited someone's literal castle. And this man had his own private art collection, one of the premier private art collections in Europe. He lets us into his own gallery. And the first thing I noticed is the Filipina maid in the castle. And she's like looking at me the whole time. And I finally just started a conversation with her. And she seemed shocked to be welcoming a Filipino guest instead of a Filipino worker. And it's happened to me so often. And I have relatives who have that experience, that it's made me want to explore it more. So that's what I'm working on.
Yeah. Oh, it sounds so powerful. It sounds so necessary. Yeah, and it picks up on a strand that's in this novel as well. So I can't wait, Lysley.
It'll be about 25 years.
Not 25. It's got to be quicker than that. I hope for your sake and for my sake. But it's been great to talk to you. I would love to talk more. We'll talk more later, but thank you so much for making time for this interview. For everyone, just a reminder, the two books are Monstress, the collection of stories, and The Son of Good Fortune. You can read more about them on the website. Lysley Tenorio, thank you so much for being with us here today on The Conversation.
Thanks so much, Ed. It was awesome. A good